You are watching this special edition of India Global with me, Parmeshwar Bava. At the moment, we are coming to you from the International Media Center. At the background, you can see the Bharat Mandapam, where leaders of the 19 wealthiest nations and the European Union will descend tomorrow for 24 hours of tough talk and hopefully build consensus as well. Our focus currently is on Joe Biden touching down in New Delhi. He headed straight to LKM, 7 LKM, the Prime Minister's residence, for bilateral talks. We take a deep dive into the expected outcomes from this US-India bilateral on this special edition of India Global. We're coming to you live from outside Bharat Mandapam. In fact, joining us on the broadcast this evening, we've got with us Meera Shankar, former ambassador of India to the United States. Also joining us, Ashok Malik, partner and chair of the India Practice Asia Group. Raymond Vickery, former US Assistant Secretary of Commerce. And in a short while from now, for the latest from Ground Zero in terms of US, we are going to be joined by the founder of newsmobile.in, Saurabh Shukla. Let me take my first question straight to the former ambassador of India to the US, Meera Shankar. Lots of expected outcomes, whether it's a jet engine deal, whether it's MQ-9 Reapers, collaboration in 6G and 5G networks, also cooperation in civil nuclear equipment. Ma'am, what do you think is going to be the most significant outcome as far as this bilateral is concerned?
Look, I think this bilateral reflects the depth of the strategic partnership between India and the United States, coming so soon after the state visit of Prime Minister Modi. It enables the two leaders to ensure that the momentum in the relationship is maintained and that the decisions that were taken during Prime Minister Modi's visit, which were quite significant in deepening the strategic partnership, are implemented or get off the ground so that they acquire an implementation momentum. For instance, the Reaper drones, where price negotiations were still to be completed, the GE-HAL F-414 joint production of the jet engines, where US congressional approval has now been obtained. So, you can proceed with the deal, and it's important to have a time frame. The new discussions on small nuclear reactors, because discussions were held with Westinghouse in the past on nuclear collaboration, but they didn't really succeed because the US had concerns over India's liability law, and India had concerns over the commercial aspects because the price of the per unit of electricity that would have been the result of the Westinghouse deal would have been too high for the Indian market to absorb. So both these aspects have to be dealt with. Now Westinghouse is proposing cooperation in small modular nuclear reactors. So that's a new discussion which may get
Shankar,
off
we're
the
getting
ground.
live visuals after Joe Biden and Prime Minister Modi's bilateral. I sincerely apologize, I'm cutting you through, but we have live visuals of the bilateral meeting that has just concluded between our Prime Minister and Joe Biden. Do carry on, Ms. Shankar.
Yes, and I do expect that there will be decisions which are people-centric, like the opening of new consulates by both sides, as well as some announcements on easing of visa restrictions or streamlining of visa procedures at the US missions in India, because this has been a major irritant in the relationship in recent months and years, because after COVID, the waiting time for getting a visa or getting an appointment for a visa is over a year and a half in some cases. So it completely, goes against the kind of intensified partnership that we are seeking.
Absolutely. In fact, it was tragically comical. About 6 months ago, we were checking the visa appointments only available after 12 months. That's almost 1 calendar year, 1.5 calendar year. So we're hoping for progress on that front, hoping for ease in partnerships as far as student visas and student work visas are concerned post their studying. But I'd also like to bring in Mr. Malik at this point. Mr. Malik, Do you think realistically India and the United States can iron out their differences as far as the nuclear domain is concerned?
Well, as Ambassador Shankar said, the nuclear issue has been discussed for the past 15 years. The significant change this year, or in the current time frame, is the emergence of small modular reactors. There are no small modular reactors out there in the market yet. No, I don't think there's a single SMR that's been certified, but many, more than one, is at the cusp of certification. India also has its own SMR program. India is also building an indigenous SMR. More than a purchase of SMRs, there could be some conversations around co-production and co-development and design of SMRs. Having said that, when it comes to deployment of SMRs in India or deployment of any non-Indian nuclear reactors in India, the Indian liability law, which is one of the world's strictest laws and places the liability on the supplier rather than just the operator, is still a roadblock which has to be navigated. It will to overcome that roadblock will require an amendment to a law passed by Parliament. Quite honestly, I can't see this government going to Parliament before the elections and asking for that law to be amended. So what the workaround will be, I do not know. But I do expect some forward movement on co-development and co-researching SMRs, because both India and the US have indigenous
well, let's cross our fingers that there is some forward
SMRs.
development.
Sorry?
Right, we also have Saurabh Shukla joining us from News Mobile in at the moment. Mr. Shukla, always great to chat with you. Now, there's been a lot of chatter whether there's going to be a joint communique, whether there's going to be a New Delhi declaration. In fact, the US National Security Advisor this morning had positively signaled that they are working all day and night towards a joint communique. What have you been hearing in the corridors of power, and do you think it's going to materialize?
I think so, yes. I think what I'm gathering is that there is already a communique that has been agreed. There are certain nuts and bolts that are still to be worked out. But the manner in which India's diplomatic might, coupled with the image of being a consensus builder, despite the fact that China played spoilsport, that seems to have got a resonance amongst G20 countries, whether there are countries of the global south or countries like the US. If you see Joe Biden putting his might behind India's G20 presidency, he did not go to the ASEAN summit. He's landed here. He's having talks with the Prime Minister. All that gives a signal that the world is standing with the Indian narrative that is going to come out of G20. It's India's solution for the global challenges that plague the world. Whether it's the global south or the developed world, they've realized that things like UPI, things like COVID, whether it's inclusion, whether it's transformation of economic institutions like the World Bank and IMF, because if you have to find solutions to challenges like climate change, you have to provide funding to the developing countries. All that is only going to come if there is some kind of a transformation and some kind of change that is being effected. And that is going to be a big success of this summit. And you will see when finally a declaration comes out, it will spell out a roadmap. That will be a new paradigm for a rule-based international order, which brings in economic equality and also inclusion for all these countries which have been at the periphery. Permission. Yeah.
Well, let's hope the next 60 hours are power-packed for us. But just touching upon the fact that the Prime Minister, ahead of the G20 summit, in his editorial had also mentioned that they're falling back. He acknowledged that they're falling back on the sustainable development goals. As far as US and India are concerned, do you think we can make any tangible progress on in these round of talks?
Absolutely. You know, there are obviously, like friends, there will be differences. Obviously, there are different approaches that are there. Even between India and the US, there are, and in fact, behind closed doors, when they talk, whether it was the talks in Washington, D.C. or which are happening right now, there will be differences. But the idea is, how do you bridge these differences? And one of the biggest sticking point was when the developed world wanted concessions on climate change, wanted forward movements by the developing countries. The biggest, the challenge was, where do you find financing for that? And that's the reason why role of the World Bank, IMF comes into play. And you will see that there will be a way out which will be found, and G20 New Delhi Leaders Summit will pave the way for that. That's the trajectory we are working on.
Well, that's a positive trajectory.
Absolutely.
Let's also bring in on the broadcast with us at the moment, we have Raymond Vickery. Mr. Vickery, as Mr. Shukla has just pointed out, consensus is also emerging on a greater level as far as capital and multilateral development banks are concerned. Would you like to comment on that?
Yes, I would. Thanks very much for having me and giving me this opportunity. I think that, as Ambassador Shankar has said, a first order of business is going to be to continue the relationship which was put on display in June in Washington. President Biden has met with Prime Minister Modi more than a dozen times. And it is the two greatest democracies in the world going to follow through on that. But beyond the question of bilateral issues is what the United States and India can do together to promote peace and prosperity throughout the world. And the major thrust in that regard is going to be an increase in available funding for the World Bank and other multilateral institutions. In a way, this is a counter to the Chinese Belt and Road Initiative, which has had uneconomic terms and consequences, as you know, in Sri Lanka with Hambantota, and being able to further Chinese geopolitical goals. What Prime Minister Modi and President Biden will be able to present is leadership for using a more sustainable approach to infrastructure development, to finance on climate change. And I expect that this is going to be a major deliverable coming out of this G20.
We are also hoping that it's a major deliverable that comes out of this Leaders Summit. Before Mr. Shukla leaves us, I just want to quickly ask you, according to you, what's the most conspicuous and telling absence that's expected at the summit?
Well, you know that the big absence is there, but I've been saying that this is the biggest diplomatic party in town. If you miss out, then you miss the bus. And everybody gets this loud and clear that, there is a certain country, China, which did not, have its head of state, Mr. Xi Jinping, coming in to send a message to India. But the message is going to the wider world that you're not interested in tackling the biggest challenges that the world faces. And if you're missing out on a larger, wider diplomatic agenda that's being set up at this summit.
And to almost contribute in a positive manner to the whole bandwagon of multilateralism.
Yes, absolutely. That's what the world, it's about inclusivity. It's about inclusivity, the larger global good. And this is what every country should be working on, not get into an ego trip, which is happening. And, I'm glad Prime Minister Narendra Modi demonstrated his muscular diplomacy at the ASEAN when he did not mince any words. That any country which is trying to, get into others' territory should realize there is a rule-based international order that works. And I think post the New Delhi summit, a rule-based international order will be established even more in a more vibrant manner.
Well, let's see what this rule-based world order is like post the pandemic. Thank you so much, Mr. Shukla, for joining us on NDTV.
Thank you so much.
With that, let's go across to Ms. Shankar, who's also on the broadcast with us. I'm going to ask you the same question, Ms. Shankar. For you, what is the most conspicuous absence at this G20 Leaders Summit in New Delhi?
Well, I think that, the outcomes that India has put on the table and the proposals that it has made are very substantial in a range of areas. For instance, in health, there's a proposal to have a WHO platform, digital platform, which will integrate all the national platforms which were set up to deal with COVID. So if you have another pandemic, all countries will be able to be on one platform and to actually gain information and sharing of experiences in a very, very seamless manner. Secondly, I think there seems to be some consensus on the need to reform the multilateral lending institutions, the World Bank and the IMF. We have suggested that there is need for greater voice for the developing countries in these institutions. And there is a report by Larry Summers and N.K. Singh, which has proposed that the mandate of the World Bank should be expanded to include the funding of global public goods, and also that the order of magnitude of resources that they need has to be raised manyfold to deal with the challenges of both climate change, an energy transition, and adaptation and mitigation to the consequences of global warming. And on the other hand, to accelerate the sustainable development goals, where many least developed countries have fallen behind because of the shocks that their economies have endured as a result of the pandemic and the conflict in Ukraine, leading to high levels of debt in these countries. So again, we have proposals for debt relief, to have a common platform for rescheduling debt for the least developed countries. There seems to be some broad agreement that cryptocurrencies should be regulated under a regulatory framework, even for the creation of digital public infrastructure to bring about financial inclusion. In taking India's example, where that has been one of the key successes that India has had in recent years in terms of development. So there are a number of proposals on the table, and these proposals are going to shape the agenda of the G20 going forward, not just, in this summit, but also the summits which come. For instance, Brazil is expected to take forward many of these issues when it assumes the presidency next year. And these are issues which require urgent action by all countries, because they don't respect national boundaries and they require global cooperation to actually move the needle forward, and also action by countries in a coordinated fashion on a multi-year basis to achieve results. It's not something which is a one-off. So on all these issues, I do expect that the G20 summit will definitely move the needle forward. I hope we are able to isolate differences, geopolitical differences over the Ukraine conflict, and have a resolution, because most countries want to get on with the issues which are so pressing for each of them, rather than get bogged down in the issues which divide countries on the basis of geopolitics. Yes,
absolutely,
it's important to those who are engaged in those conflicts, but the rest of the world would really like to see forward movement towards a more peaceful world and towards being able to insulate this conflict from impacting the rest of the world on a very broad basis.
Right. Let's also quickly bring in Mr. Malik. He's been patiently waiting. Mr. Malik, now with different leagues, different groupings like the BRICS, the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, now we have the G20, 19 wealthiest nations with the European Union, also push for the African Union to be a part of this grouping. How exactly do these different leagues and overlapping interests actually play out in real life? It sounds very utopic, yes, and ideally we want a world which has only peace and only harmony and no conflict. But when we talk about this on the ground, how do we help to manifest it with so many different leagues?
Well, that's a very good question, because if you look at the current multilateral order, which was drawn up at the end of the Second World War, post-1945, it was drawn up essentially to maintain peace peace and order and build economies in the Euro-Atlantic zone, in the area between the United States and Europe, largely Western Europe. Today, the challenges are in the Indo-Pacific. The opportunities are also in the Indo-Pacific. The economy is moving to the Indo-Pacific. And separately, but relatedly, the challenges for the hearts and minds of the global South, countries that are being pulled in different directions by multiple global challenges, the Ukraine war, the COVID crisis and its aftermath, and the growing geopolitical tension between China and the United States, or quite honestly, in Asia between India and China. So the big innovation with this G20 summit that India has brought about, and which I think will continue, as Ambassador Shankar said, with the Brazil G20 and with South Africa's G20 follow after that, is bringing in the issues that are central to the global South, to the 120 or 150 odd developing countries, bringing their issues of sustainable climate finance, their issues of sustainable debt, their issues of sustainable development goals, their issues of energy transition, their issues of food security. Those issues have been brought into the heart of the G20 process. And quite honestly, the multilateral order as we know it has to accommodate and embrace issues of the global South, of poorer countries in Asia and Africa, which are part of the broader Indo-Pacific, if it is to remain relevant to today's geopolitics and today's narrative. Yeah. Yeah, Parmeshwar.
Right. Let's also bring in Mr. Vikri as we wrap. Well, Mr. Vikri, homogenizing the global South. What are the dangers of it? It's like almost creating a polarized order. Do you see any dangers, or is the global North and global South not problematic for you, the terms?
Well, I think that the Prime Minister and India have chosen exactly the right theme for this G20, and that is one Earth, one family, one future. And we can talk about global South versus global North. We can talk about East versus West. But the fact is that the world is so integrated today that those kinds of distinctions are not particularly useful in meeting worldwide problems. There is no such thing as being just to isolate war. Prime Minister Modi has made it very plain. This is not a time for war. And so the challenge is to bring in Africa more fully and to make good on the theme which India has set for this G20.
Well, let's hope the next 60 hours have positive outcomes for the 20 nations and the rest of us, because the ripple effects, as we've seen in a world that's so interconnected, the ripple effects are felt by one and all. Thank you so much for making time for us and joining us on India Global. That's all we could pack in this special edition of India Global for you. We are coming to you from outside Bharat, Mandapam, where the G20 leaders are going to meet over 9th and 10th of September. That's all on India Global. Thanks for watching.